Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with life on a busy Friday morning. Jonathan Hayes, a 45-year-old entrepreneur, strode briskly toward his boarding gate. Dressed in an expensive suit and gripping a leather briefcase, he checked his platinum watch with growing impatience. Another business trip, he thought with a sigh. Despite his wealth and influence, an emptiness loomed over him, a void that no amount of money could ever fill. Then, something caught his eye. A woman walked past, her brown hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders. Beside her, a young boy, no older than 10, held her hand. Jonathan stopped in his tracks, his breath hitching. The woman's face, so achingly familiar, made his heart pound. "Emily?" he whispered in disbelief. But it wasn't just seeing Emily that stunned him. The boy next to her was a mirror of his own childhood self, the same deep blue eyes, the same unruly dark hair. Even his posture was identical to Jonathan's when he was that age. A memory crashed into Jonathan like a tidal wave. 10 years ago, he had slipped out of the apartment he once shared with Emily, leaving behind only a cold, heartless letter on the kitchen table. He could still see her peaceful face in his mind, fast asleep, unaware that by morning, her entire world would shatter. His legs felt weak. Could it be? Was Emily pregnant back then? Had he abandoned not only his wife, but a child? A son he never even knew existed? A rush of guilt and disbelief surged through him. Without thinking, Jonathan took a step forward, his pulse racing. He needed answers. He needed to explain. He needed to understand. But just as he moved, the airport crowd surged between them, separating him from Emily and the boy. "Emily," he called out, desperation lacing his voice. But his words were swallowed by the noise of the busy terminal. He pushed through the crowd, frantic to reach them. By the time he broke free, they were gone. Panic set in as Jonathan turned in every direction, scanning the terminal. But there was no sign of them. "Sir, are you all right?" A flight attendant's voice barely registered in his mind. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't have to look to know who it was. Samantha, his wife, his current wife. He let it ring. Right now, she didn't matter. Nothing did, except finding Emily and the boy. "Sir, your flight is boarding," the attendant reminded him. Jonathan hesitated. He looked at the boarding gate, then back at the airport lobby, his thoughts spinning. A decision settled deep in his chest. "I'm not getting on that flight," he said, already turning away. The flight attendant blinked in surprise, but Jonathan was no longer paying attention. Exiting the terminal, he waved down a cab. "Downtown," he instructed the driver, his mind in turmoil. As the car pulled into the thick Los Angeles traffic, Jonathan reached for his phone again, but not to return Samantha's calls. Instead, he dialed an old number, one he hadn't used in years. The line picked up. "Frank, it's Jonathan. I need your help." His voice was sharp with urgency. "I need to find someone." And as he relayed the little he knew about Emily, one thought dominated his mind. That boy might be my son. Guilt, curiosity, and fear knotted together inside him. His life was about to change forever, and for the first time in years, success and money felt utterly meaningless. What mattered now was finding Emily and the boy, and somehow making right the greatest mistake of his life. Jonathan stepped out of the taxi in downtown Los Angeles, his hands trembling as he paid the fare. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I have to find them." Murmuring the words like a vow, he pushed open the door to Frank Dawson's office. The small detective agency smelled of old paper and burnt coffee. Frank, an old friend from college turned private investigator, sat behind his cluttered desk, eyebrows raised at Jonathan's sudden appearance. "What's going on?" Frank asked, leaning back in his chair. Jonathan sat down, his fingers running through his hair. "I saw her, Frank. Emily. At the airport. And there was a boy with her. He looked just like me." Frank studied him carefully. "Do you realize what you're doing, Jonathan? This could change everything in your life." "I know." Jonathan exhaled, his voice tight with emotion. "But I need to know the truth. I need to make this right." Frank sighed and reached for a notepad. "Tell me everything you remember. Where was she last living? What was she doing?" Jonathan closed his eyes, pulling the past to the surface. Every memory of Emily felt like a dagger of regret. "She was a teacher," he began. "She worked at an elementary school on the north side. We lived in an apartment not far from there." As he recounted details, his phone vibrated on the desk. Samantha, again. His wife had been calling non-stop, but Jonathan ignored it. He couldn't deal with her right now. "This will take time," Frank warned. "I'll need a few days to gather solid information." Jonathan nodded, his impatience clear. "Do whatever it takes. Money is no object." Leaving the detective's office, Jonathan walked aimlessly through the city. Los Angeles had once felt like his kingdom, a place where his ambition had taken him to the top. But now it felt foreign, almost hostile. He had spent the past decade building wealth and power, convincing himself that success was all that mattered. But at this moment, he would trade it all to undo his biggest mistake. He had to find Emily and the boy before it was too late. Memories of the past. Across the city, Emily Monroe started her morning as she always did. The small house she now called home was filled with the soft sounds of cartoons playing from the living room. "Ethan, breakfast," she called, flipping pancakes onto a plate. A 10-year-old boy with messy dark hair ran into the kitchen, grinning. "Pancakes?" Emily smiled, ruffling his hair. But as she looked at him, her chest tightened. No matter how much time passed, she couldn't ignore it. Ethan was the spitting image of Jonathan. As Ethan ate, Emily drifted into the past. The years after Jonathan left had been a nightmare. Pregnant and alone, she had struggled to keep her teaching job as her belly grew. A flashback struck her. 8 months pregnant, sitting on the bathroom floor sobbing, unpaid bills scattered around her. She had been terrified, but she had survived. Shaking away the memories, Emily whispered, "We made it, didn't we, sweetheart?" Ethan was too focused on his pancakes to hear her. The doorbell rang, pulling her back to the present. It was Mark. Her boyfriend of 2 years stood in the doorway, his warm brown eyes filled with affection. "Morning, my loves," he said, kissing Emily on the cheek and giving Ethan a playful hug. Emily felt a wave of gratitude. Mark had been a rock in her life, a kind and steady presence who had accepted Ethan as if he were his own. But deep inside, something unsettled her. Ever since she had seen that man at the airport, the one who looked too much like Jonathan, an uneasy feeling had taken root in her chest. Something was about to change. The truth revealed across town. Jonathan's phone rang. He grabbed it immediately. "I found her," Frank's voice came through. "She still lives in the same neighborhood. A small house on Willow Lane." Jonathan's pulse quickened. "And?" he pressed. "The boy?" Frank hesitated. "She has a son, Ethan, 10 years old. Attends the local elementary school." Jonathan gripped the phone tighter, his worst fears confirmed. It was true. He had a son he had never met. Frank continued, "There's something else. She's been in a relationship for 2 years. A guy named Mark. From what I've found, he's very involved in their lives." A sharp pang of jealousy shot through Jonathan. He had no right to feel that way, not after what he had done, but he felt it anyway. The Watcher in the Shadows. That night, in her luxurious mansion in the hills, Samantha paced furiously. Jonathan had been unreachable for days. First, he missed an important flight. Now, he had vanished altogether. Something was wrong. Her mind whirled with possibilities. Had he found someone else? Was he hiding something? Gritting her teeth, she grabbed her phone. "I want you to track my husband," she instructed her private investigator. "Find out exactly what he's been up to." She wasn't about to let him slip away. A family he never knew. The next morning, Mark helped Ethan with his backpack while Emily packed his lunch. "Don't forget, we have dinner with my parents tonight," Mark reminded her. Emily smiled and nodded, but a sense of unease lingered. Outside, parked a few houses away, Jonathan sat in his car, watching. His hands tightened around the steering wheel as he saw them step out of the house. Emily looked as beautiful as ever. Ethan, laughing beside her, was a piece of him he had never known existed. And then there was Mark. They looked like a perfect family. Jonathan's heart clenched. Guilt, regret, jealousy, fear, but also determination. He couldn't walk away again, a fateful encounter. For the next few days, Jonathan stayed close, observing their routine from a distance. Every glimpse of Ethan made his chest ache. Finally, on a warm afternoon, he gathered his courage. Stepping out of his car, he walked along the sidewalk as Emily emerged from the house, watering her plants. Their eyes met. The watering can slipped from her fingers, water spilling onto the pavement. "Jonathan," she whispered, her face pale with shock. Before he could speak, she marched toward him, her eyes flashing with anger. "What are you doing here?" Her voice trembled, a mixture of rage and disbelief. Jonathan swallowed hard. "Emily, I saw you at the airport with Ethan. I needed to." Don't, her voice cut like ice. Don't you dare say his name. Curious neighbors peeked through their windows, drawn by the tension in the air. Jonathan took a shaky breath. I know I have no right, he said softly. But please, Emily, I need to know him. Her jaw clenched, tears forming in her eyes. You lost that right 10 years ago. Jonathan felt the weight of her words crush him. But he wasn't leaving. Not this time. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, drawn by the commotion. Emily, please, Jonathan begged, desperation thick in his voice. I know I messed up, but Ethan, he's my son, isn't he? Emily closed her eyes, inhaling sharply. When she opened them again, unshed tears shimmered in their depths. Yes, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan is your son, the son you abandoned before you even knew he existed. Jonathan felt the words hit him like a blow. I didn't know, he murmured, his throat dry. Emily's expression hardened. And if you had known, what then? She shot back. Would you have stayed? Don't lie to yourself, Jonathan. You made your choice 10 years ago. Jonathan took a step forward. Let me meet him, please. I know I don't deserve it, but… No. Emily's voice rose, sharp and unwavering. You're right. You don't deserve it. Ethan has a good life, a family that loves him. I won't let you ruin that. Just then, a car pulled up to the house. Mark stepped out, his face shifting from confusion to concern as he took in the tension between Emily and the well-dressed stranger standing too close. Everything okay, love? He asked, placing a protective hand on Emily's shoulder. Jonathan clenched his fists. A surge of jealousy rose in him. Irrational, undeserved, but impossible to ignore. Emily didn't take her eyes off Jonathan. It is, she answered firmly. He was just leaving. Mark looked between them, suspicion growing in his eyes. Do you two know each other? Before Emily could respond, the sound of a school bus stopping at the corner made her stomach drop. Ethan. Panic seized her. Jonathan, leave now, she hissed. Without thinking, Jonathan ducked behind a tree as Ethan stepped off the bus, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Mom? Ethan frowned, noticing the tension in her posture. Is everything okay? Emily forced a smile. Everything's great, sweetheart. Let's go inside. Okay? Mark will help you with your homework. Ethan nodded, oblivious, and walked toward the house. Mark hesitated for a moment before following him in, glancing back at Emily with silent concern. Emily stayed behind, her shoulders stiff. Jonathan stepped out from behind the tree, devastation written all over his face. Emily, No, she cut him off, her voice trembling. You have no idea what I've been through. What Ethan has been through. I won't let you destroy everything we've built. With that, she turned and went inside, shutting the door firmly behind her. Jonathan stood frozen on the sidewalk, feeling more lost than ever. He had been so close, and yet Ethan still felt impossibly far away. Inside the house, Emily leaned against the door, her hands shaking. Mark appeared in the hallway, concern etched across his face. Emily, who was that? She looked at the man who had been her anchor for the past few years. He deserved the truth. That was Jonathan, she said, her voice faltering. Ethan's father. Mark's face paled. What? Emily took a deep breath. It's a long story, one I hoped I'd never have to tell again. Across town, Jonathan sat alone in his hotel room, staring blankly at the city lights outside his window. For the first time in years, he was forced to confront the full weight of his past. The mistakes, the selfishness, the consequences. Memories surfaced, ones he had buried deep. 5 years before he left, Emily had excitedly told him about a promotion at her school. That's great, he had said, barely looking up from his newspaper. But don't get too excited, it's just an elementary school. He remembered how her bright expression had dimmed. Another memory, Emily mentioning she wanted to save up for a master's degree. Jonathan had laughed. For what? He had scoffed. It's not like you'll earn much more just teaching kids to color. Now, the shame gnawed at him. How could he have been so blind? A question left unanswered. Back at the house, Emily and Mark sat in the kitchen, speaking in hushed voices after Ethan had gone to bed. Do you think we should tell him? Mark asked gently. Emily exhaled, rubbing her temples. I don't know. He has the right to know, but what if it hurts him? What if Jonathan disappears again? Mark pulled her into a reassuring hug. Whatever happens, we'll handle it together. The next morning, Ethan wandered into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. Where's Mom? He asked, yawning. She had to leave early, Mark replied, setting a plate of pancakes in front of him. Ethan poked at his food with his fork, his expression thoughtful. Mark? Yeah, champ? Ethan hesitated. Can I ask you something? Of course. It's about my real dad. Mark's grip on his coffee cup tightened slightly. What do you want to know? Ethan frowned. Why did he leave? Did he not like me? Mark's heart twisted. He knelt beside Ethan's chair, choosing his words carefully. Hey, it's nothing like that. It's complicated. But I promise you, it had nothing to do with you. Ethan nodded, but doubt still flickered in his eyes. A father's longing outside, parked down the street. Jonathan watched through the window. He saw Mark ruffle Ethan's hair, saw the way Ethan smiled at him, and his stomach clenched. Mark had taken the role Jonathan had abandoned. Jonathan had no one to blame but himself. Still, he couldn't walk away. Determined, he waited until Ethan left for school. As the boy passed by, Jonathan stepped forward, keeping his voice light. Hey kid, is this your ball? He held up a soccer ball. Ethan eyed him warily. No. Oh, I thought maybe it rolled out of your yard. Do you play? Sometimes, with Mark. Jonathan swallowed his jealousy. Cool. You know, I used to play a lot when I was your age. They chatted for a few minutes. Small talk, nothing serious. But Jonathan savored every second, memorizing every detail of Ethan's face. Ethan glanced at his watch. I gotta go. I'll be late for school. Of course, Jonathan said, reluctant to let him go. It was nice talking to you, Ethan. Ethan gave a small wave before running off. Jonathan stood there, a mix of joy and sadness swirling inside him. It was only a few minutes, but it was something. It was a start. A dangerous discovery. Far away in a sprawling mansion, Samantha finally got the information she had been waiting for. A private investigator placed a folder on the table in front of her. A son? Samantha hissed, her grip tightening on the papers. That idiot has a son he never told me about? She paced the room, her mind racing. Now it all made sense. Jonathan's sudden change in behavior, his absence. A cruel smile touched her lips. So that's how it's going to be, dear? But she murmured. Trading this life for a schoolteacher and a kid? She picked up her phone and dialed. Mr. Johnson, I need you to investigate this boy Ethan. Find out everything, and prepare the divorce papers. Hanging up, she smirked. If Jonathan thought he could walk away so easily, he was in for a very rude awakening. Ethan sat on the couch, his legs curled under him, spooning cereal into his mouth when Emily sat down beside him. Sweetheart, she said softly. Ethan glanced up. Yeah, Mom? She took a steadying breath, her hands trembling slightly. There's something I need to tell you. Ethan nodded, curious. Emily hesitated for a second before forcing herself to say the words. Your father, he's in town. He wants to meet you. Ethan froze. His spoon clattered into the bowl. What? His voice was barely above a whisper. Emily's heart ached at the way his expression shifted, from surprise to confusion, and finally to anger. He's alive? Ethan asked, his voice rising. And he wants to meet me now? Emily swallowed hard. Yes. Ethan shot to his feet. He abandoned us, he shouted. And now he suddenly cares? No, I don't want to see him. Ethan, please, Emily said gently, reaching for him. Ethan stepped back, his small hands clenched into fists. Understand what, Mom? That my real father is a coward? Tears welled in Emily's eyes as Ethan turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming his bedroom door shut. She sank into the couch, that silent sob shaking her body. She knew this would be difficult, but the pain in Ethan's voice, the hurt in his eyes, it shattered her. Across town, Jonathan stepped into the grand foyer of Samantha's mansion. She stood at the top of the staircase, arms crossed, eyes cold. Why are you here, Jonathan? Her voice was sharp, controlled, but underneath, a storm brewed. Jonathan squared his shoulders. I'm here to tell you that it's over. A slow, humorless smile spread across Samantha's lips. Oh, darling, she drawled, descending the staircase. I already know everything. Jonathan's stomach dropped. How? Samantha let out a low, amused laugh. I always know everything. Her expression hardened. The real question is, what are you going to do about it? I'm leaving, Jonathan said firmly. I can't keep living this lie. Samantha's face twisted with fury. You think you can just walk away from me after everything I've done for you? Jonathan clenched his jaw. What you did was manipulate me. You fed my ambition. You made me abandon Emily. Samantha cut him off with a sharp laugh. I made you? She mocked. Don't play the victim, Jonathan. You chose money. You chose power. I simply held the door open. Jonathan felt the shame burn in his chest. She was right. But now he was choosing differently. "I don't care about the money anymore," he said. "I just want to make things right." Samantha's expression darkened. She stepped closer, her voice low and venomous. "If you walk out that door," she whispered, "I will destroy you. Every under-the-table deal, every bribe, every shady transaction you ever made, I'll make sure the world knows." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. She meant it. She would burn his empire to the ground. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of losing everything. Because for the first time, he knew what truly mattered. That evening, Mark came home to find Emily still sitting on the couch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "What happened?" he asked, concerned. Emily looked up, her eyes red. "I told Ethan." Mark exhaled, sitting beside her. "And? He hates him," she whispered. "He doesn't want to see him." Mark pulled her into his arms, rubbing her back soothingly. But she could feel his hesitation. "Do you think I did the right thing?" she murmured. Mark hesitated. "I think so. But what now? Is Jonathan going to be part of our lives?" Emily heard the fear in his voice. "Mark," she said, meeting his gaze, "you're the one who's always been here. You're his family." Mark nodded, but something unspoken lingered between them. Doubt, uncertainty. That night, Jonathan wandered the empty streets of Los Angeles, Samantha's threats echoing in his mind. He thought about the years he had spent chasing wealth, power, everything he thought he needed. He thought about Emily's dreams, how he had dismissed them so easily. He thought about his son, Ethan, a boy who had lived his entire life without a father because he had been too blinded by greed. Standing outside Emily's house, he saw the bedroom light turn off upstairs. His son was so close, yet so far. Jonathan clenched his fists. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the night. "Sorry for everything." For the first time in years, he was determined to do the right thing, no matter the cost. The next day, Jonathan saw Ethan walking home from school alone. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "Hey, Ethan," he said, offering a nervous smile. "Remember me? The soccer ball guy?" Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Yeah, what do you want?" Jonathan hesitated. "I just wanted to see how you were doing." Ethan frowned. "I'm fine." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Jonathan stood there, feeling like a complete fool. Later that night, in his hotel room, he broke down. For the first time in years, he cried. The reality of his failure as a father crushed him. From a distance, Emily had seen the awkward exchange. Part of her wanted to scream at Jonathan to stay away, to protect Ethan from any more heartbreak. But another part, a part she barely recognized, felt pity for him. That night, she sat on Ethan's bed, stroking his hair as he stared at the ceiling. "He's trying to reach out to you," she said gently. Ethan frowned. "Why?" Emily sighed. "People make mistakes, sweetheart. Sometimes, really big ones." Ethan's face darkened. "He hurt you." Emily's heart clenched. "Yes, he hurt me," Ethan whispered, his voice raw. Emily pulled him into her arms, her chest aching for the pain in his voice. Sensing the shift in their lives, Mark made a decision. One evening, under a canopy of stars, he took Emily to their favorite restaurant. He reached across the table and took her hands. "Emily," he said softly, pulling out a small velvet box. As he opened it, the candlelight caught the gleam of a diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" Emily's breath hitched. She loved Mark. He was stable, dependable. But with everything happening, I need to think about it," she said. Mark's face fell, but he nodded. "Take your time." Days later, Ethan was riding his bike down the street when a car came speeding around the corner. Jonathan, watching from across the street, saw it before Ethan did. Without thinking, he sprinted forward. "Ethan!" In one swift motion, Jonathan shoved Ethan out of the way. They tumbled onto the grass as the car screeched past. Breathing heavily, Jonathan sat up. "Are you okay?" Ethan, shaken but unharmed, nodded. "Yeah, thank you." He looked at Jonathan, his expression shifting. For the first time, there wasn't just anger. There was something else. Curiosity. Jonathan wanted to tell him everything, that he was his father, that he loved him. But for now, he just helped Ethan to his feet, and for the first time, Ethan didn't pull away. Jonathan sat in his dimly lit hotel room, staring at the ceiling. He had missed everything. Ethan's birthdays, his first steps, his childhood laughter. All moments he could never get back, but he could fight for a better future. Even if Emily and Ethan never fully forgave him, he would prove he was here now, that he wasn't walking away again. With renewed determination, he picked up his phone and made the call that would change everything. "Frank, it's Jonathan. I need your help sorting out some legal matters. It's time to settle my accounts with the past." As night fell over Los Angeles, Jonathan knew he was stepping into a storm. The worst was yet to come. But for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face whatever came his way. That Sunday afternoon, Ethan returned from a stroll in the park, kicking a small rock along the sidewalk. As he neared the house, he saw his mom on the porch, talking to him. The man from the airport, the man with the soccer ball, the man who had saved him. Something inside him clicked. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Ethan ran toward them. "It's him, isn't it?" he yelled. "It's my dad." Jonathan and Emily froze. "Ethan, I can explain," Emily started, her voice unsteady. But Ethan was already shaking, tears welling in his eyes. "Why did you lie?" he demanded. "Why did you let him get close?" Jonathan stepped forward. "Ethan, it's my fault. Your mother was only trying to protect you." Ethan's gaze snapped to him, filled with betrayal. "You abandoned us. Why are you coming back now?" His voice cracked. The confrontation lasted for hours, Ethan alternating between fury and heartbreak, Emily struggling to hold the pieces together, and Jonathan facing the brutal truths of his past mistakes. Later that night, in his office, Jonathan made the toughest call of his life. He picked up the phone, his fingers shaking. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice hollow. "This is Jonathan Hayes. I need to confess some unethical business practices I've been involved in over the years." He knew what this meant. His fortune gone, his career over. Prison was a real possibility. But he couldn't live with these secrets anymore. He had to do something right. Back at Emily's house, Mark arrived to find the tension so thick it felt suffocating. He spotted Jonathan standing near the doorway. His expression darkened. "What's going on?" Mark asked, his voice tight. Emily, emotionally drained, pulled him aside. "Mark, I can't marry you." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Mark recoiled as if he had been slapped. "Is it because of him?" he asked, pointing at Jonathan. Emily shook her head. "No, it's because of me. And Ethan, we need to figure this out. Our past. I can't drag you into this mess." Mark stared at her for a long moment before nodding stiffly. Then he walked away, leaving Emily heartbroken, but strangely relieved. The next morning, Jonathan's world collapsed. The headlines screamed in bold letters, "Business tycoon Jonathan Hayes confesses to fraud." Samantha, furious with his confession, had leaked every piece of dirt she could find. Within hours, reporters swarmed Emily's house. Flashes from cameras lit up the street. "Jonathan Hayes! Is it true you have an illegitimate child? Miss Monroe, did you know about his crimes?" Emily yanked the curtains shut as Ethan stood behind her, wide-eyed. "Mom, why are they here?" he asked, his voice small. Emily knelt beside him, brushing his hair back. "It's complicated, sweetheart," she whispered, "but it will pass." Jonathan, trapped in his hotel room, watched his empire crumble. His assets were frozen. Business partners abandoned him, and prison loomed ahead. His phone rang. "Emily?" He picked up immediately. "I'm sorry," he blurted before she could say anything. "I never wanted this to affect you and Ethan." Emily sighed. "I know, Jonathan, but it has." A heavy silence settled between them. "What do we do now?" she finally asked. Jonathan closed his eyes, guilt pressing down on him like a weight. "I'll fix this, Emily," he vowed. "Somehow." That night, as the chaos outside continued, Emily sat on Ethan's bed. He stared at the ceiling, his voice quiet. "Is he going to prison?" Emily's heart clenched. "I don't know, sweetheart." Ethan swallowed hard. "But no matter what happens," she promised, "we'll be together." Ethan didn't respond. He just turned away. And Emily wondered if she had already lost him. Jonathan sat alone in his hotel room. He had lost everything. But for the first time in his life, he felt free. He picked up the phone one last time. A deep breath. Then, "Hello, this is Jonathan Hayes. I'm ready to surrender to the authorities." A son's escape. The next morning, as dawn broke, Emily entered Ethan's room and froze. The bed was empty, the window open. A crumpled note lay on the nightstand. "I need to think. Don't look for me." Panic gripped her. She grabbed her phone and dialed with shaking hands. "Jonathan," she cried as soon as he answered. "Ethan has run away." Jonathan's world spun. "I'm on my way," he said, already rushing out the door. For the first time in years, Jonathan and Emily stood side by side, forgetting everything, past betrayals, broken hearts, united by one thing, their son. We'll find him, Jonathan swore, gripping Emily's hands. Together, they searched the streets, parks, alleyways. With each passing hour, their fear grew. What if something happens to him? Emily whispered, her voice breaking. Jonathan swallowed hard. We will find him. They had to. By late afternoon, Mark arrived, breathless. I came as soon as I heard, he said. How can I help? Emily turned to him, surprised by the kindness in his eyes. Thank you, she whispered, touching his arm. They split up, searching, and then Jonathan spotted something in the distance. A small figure on a swing, head lowered. Jonathan's heart clenched. He approached slowly. Ethan? The boy looked up, his eyes red from crying. Jonathan sat beside him, his voice soft. Why did you come back? Ethan asked, his voice raw. Why now? Jonathan exhaled. Because I made the biggest mistake of my life when I left, he said. And I've regretted it every day since. Ethan was silent. You hurt Mom, he whispered. You left us. Jonathan nodded, tears in his eyes. I know, and there's nothing I can do to change that. He hesitated. But I can tell you the truth, that I love you, that I always have. Ethan stared at him, searching his face. And for the first time, he didn't pull away. Emily gasped as she spotted Ethan sitting on the swing. Ethan, she cried, rushing forward and pulling him into her arms. Tears streamed down her face as she held him tightly, her heart pounding with relief. I was so scared, she whispered, running her fingers through his hair. Before Ethan could respond, the moment was shattered by the sound of heels clicking against the pavement. Samantha stormed into the park, fury burning in her eyes. So this is it? She spat, her gaze locked onto Jonathan. You threw away everything we built for this? She gestured toward Emily and Ethan with contempt. Jonathan stood, instinctively positioning himself between Samantha and his family. Enough, Samantha, he said firmly. It's over. Samantha let out a bitter laugh. You're going to lose everything, Jonathan. Your fortune, your freedom. And for what? Jonathan turned, looking at Emily and Ethan, his true family. For something money can't buy, he said quietly. For love. Samantha advanced, her fury growing, but Mark stepped in, his expression calm but firm. I think you'd better leave, he said, placing himself between her and the others. Samantha's lips curled in disgust. Seeing herself outnumbered, she cast Jonathan one last look of contempt before spinning on her heel and leaving without another word. A tense silence settled over the park. Jonathan turned to face Emily, Ethan, and Mark. His voice was thick with emotion. I'm sorry, he said. For everything. For the past, for the pain I've caused, for the chaos I've brought into your lives. He exhaled deeply. I'm turning myself in tomorrow, he continued. You won't have to worry about me anymore. To everyone's surprise, Ethan stepped forward. You're going to prison? He asked. Jonathan nodded solemnly. Probably. I did bad things, Ethan, and I need to pay for them. Ethan glanced at Emily, then back at Jonathan. But what if I want to get to know you? Jonathan's heart clenched. I'd like that more than anything, he whispered. But only if you want to. Emily, tears in her eyes, placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. It's your choice, sweetheart, she said. We'll be here for you, no matter what. Under the stars of the old park, a broken family began to mend. There was still much to resolve, much to forgive. But for the first time in years, there was hope. Jonathan, Emily, and Ethan embraced. A hug full of tears, regret, and above all, love. A few steps away, Mark watched the scene unfold, a sad smile on his lips. He knew he had done the right thing. The future was uncertain, but for tonight, at least, they were together. And that was enough. The sound of the judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom. Jonathan stood before the court as the verdict was read. Guilty. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison and ordered to return all his ill-gotten wealth. But as the guards led him away, there was no anger in his heart. No resentment. To him, it was a fair price to pay. A price for his mistakes. In the months that followed, Jonathan used his time behind bars wisely. He enrolled in business ethics courses. He began developing programs to help small businesses. And through it all, Emily kept her word. She brought Ethan to visit. At first, the visits were tense, filled with awkward silences. But little by little, father and son started to know each other. How was school this week? Jonathan would ask. Ethan would shrug at first, giving short, one-word answers. But eventually, he started opening up. I had a math test, he admitted one day. I think I did okay. Jonathan smiled, his chest swelling with pride. I'm sure you did great. You're smart, Ethan. Ethan ducked his head, hiding a small smile. Over time, their conversations deepened. Ethan asked tough questions about the past, and Jonathan answered, honestly, no matter how painful it was. Emily watched their relationship grow with cautious hope. During one visit, she pulled Jonathan aside. He needs you as a father, she said, but I can't risk him being hurt again. Jonathan nodded, his expression serious. I understand, and I'll do everything I can to be the father he deserves. Meanwhile, life outside the prison walls continued. After months of honest conversations, Emily and Mark decided to give their relationship a second chance. On a sunny spring day, Emily walked down the aisle in a simple, elegant dress. Mark stood at the altar waiting for her, love shining in his eyes. Ethan proudly carried the wedding rings. And though Jonathan was still behind bars, he received the news with mixed emotions. There was a twinge of sadness, but mostly there was relief. Emily and Ethan had found stability. They had found love. And that was what mattered. When Jonathan was finally released, he was a changed man. Determined to rebuild his life the right way, he started working with an NGO that provided free consulting for struggling small businesses. I want to use my skills for good now, he explained to Ethan during one of their weekly meetings at the park. Ethan, now 12, looked up at him with newfound respect. That's cool, Dad. The word hit Jonathan like a lightning bolt. It was a title he had once thrown away, but now he was earning it, day by day. Emily watched the new family dynamic unfold with careful optimism. She and Mark gave Ethan a stable home. And Jonathan, though not always present, was involved. A year after his release, Jonathan attended Ethan's school science fair. Standing beside Emily and Mark, he watched Ethan proudly present his project. Jonathan felt a wave of gratitude. He wasn't the father he once imagined he'd be. But he was there, and that was enough. I'm proud of you, son, Jonathan told Ethan after the presentation. Ethan beamed, then did something that caught everyone off guard. He hugged Jonathan, then Emily, then Mark. It was a moment no one could have predicted months ago. An unconventional family, but one bound together by love. That night, as Jonathan sat alone in his modest apartment, he reflected on the man he used to be. The selfish, greedy version of himself who once dismissed Emily's ambitions. The version of himself who had run from responsibility. And the version of himself who had lost everything, only to gain something far greater. Emily stopped by later to pick up Ethan. As she stood in the doorway, Jonathan met her gaze. Thank you, he said softly, for giving me this chance. Emily's eyes softened. You're making an effort, Jonathan. Ethan sees it. We all do. Jonathan watched as they left. And for the first time in years, he felt peace. He had once thought wealth and power would fulfill him. But in the end, his greatest treasure was the chance to be a better man. The road ahead was still long. There was much to learn, much to earn. But for the first time in his life, Jonathan was on the right path. Under the stars of Los Angeles, he made a silent promise. To himself, to Emily, to Ethan, to everyone he had ever hurt. He would live the rest of his days with integrity, compassion, and love. Because some second chances were worth everything.